My name is Christy Cole. I am the Women's Discipleship Advisor at Grace Church in Greenville, South Carolina.
My name is Don Williams, and I'm the Employment Director for Jumpstart, South Carolina.
I'm Kerry Sanders. I'm on staff with Grace Church and also the Inside Program Director for Jumpstart.
I'm Brian Spearman. I'm the pastor at Marietta First Baptist Church, and I'm super excited to be here.
And I'm Bill White. I'm one of the pastors here on staff at Grace Church, and really excited to have the opportunity to talk about re-entry and discipleship.
Yeah, today I'm excited about our time together to discuss why prison ministry matters to the local church and also to believers. Many are aware that imprisonment is a serious issue in our country. Over 2 million people are currently incarcerated in the United States. Of those 2 million, 95% will one day be released back into our communities. We all are aware that many will not leave prison prepared to be productive members of society. Today, we want to discuss why discipleship, rooted in the Great Commission, is the solution to help those incarcerated find purpose and find a productive life after prison. We want to kick it off by asking Brian, what does Jesus think about those who are incarcerated?
I think that's a very interesting question, but it's also one that I've really been putting a lot of thought process into lately because just talking and learning more about Jumpstart's ministry and some things through Carrie here, I've really just kind of thought back to some things that as Jesus looks at us, we're all one decision away from being maybe in prison. I mean, you look in God's Word, and Jesus was there. I think he would have talked to people who made decisions like that because it's in the Bible. We know that he talked to people who made decisions. And so the more I look at it, in fact, I was looking back and reading on some things this past weekend, and one of the just perfect examples that I could think of is Jesus looked at sin as sin. Like there's no sin that's greater than another sin in his eyes. And so I was studying about one of the guys that I remember hearing about as a kid, Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a serial killer and killed 17 men and boys. And the fact that he came to Christ in prison because another guy sent him a Bible and talked to him. And because of that, he came to Christ in prison. All right, and then I can remember, I saw it on the news, and then not long after that, I can remember that his life was taken by another prisoner. But the fact is I do believe that Jesus can save anybody. And I truly believe that it was a life change in his life. And then you find out that there was a pastor who actually came in to baptize him. That was the problem that Dahmer had. He said, well, I don't have a pastor to baptize him. And so one of the pastors went in and baptized him when other pastors were scared to even go in. And for me, I think if we look through the eyes of Christ and we're looking at those who are in prison or incarcerated or coming out of prison, we have to have some compassion and the idea and understand that, you know what, I could be in the same boat depending on what decisions that I make. We're all one decision away from being in a place where, you know what, we might be in the same boat. So I think Christ, we have to look through the lens of Christ when we look at those that are incarcerated.
Thank you, Brian. You know, Bill, some in our community and maybe even in churches would say, you know, they made a mistake, they deserve to be there, and in some cases lock them up and throw away the key. What would you say to a person that believes that's the best approach for those who are incarcerated? What do you think Christ would say to that mindset?
Well, I mean, the idea that you have to either be for mercy or for justice, I think that's what people are struggling with, is if someone has committed a crime, they've broken the law, do they need to suffer a penalty for that? Yeah, they do. But the idea, there are a bunch of problems. First of all, let's just say pragmatically, take Jesus out of it. So we want to put Jesus into it, but if we take Jesus out of it, we can't keep incarcerating people at the rate that we're incarcerating them. I'm not an expert on it, but I know we incarcerate more people than any other developed nation. Am I right in
yes,
that?
Sir.
Yeah, okay. So in the future in that, And that reveals something about what's going on in our culture. One, that we got some profound brokenness. Culturally, we have some brokenness probably in our legal code. We got all kinds of problems that we're trying to address. But the idea that there's no mercy and grace for people who are offenders, if that's the case, then we're done.
Right.
We're all done. And so the idea that if we know that God has chosen us to be the holy people that he loves, which is a part of, it's the text that we're memorizing right now as a church, then what is it that we're supposed to do? Then we're supposed to be a people who put on tenderhearted mercy, right? We put on humility. We don't regard ourselves as being better than other folks. And so the whole point of the gospel is that Jesus enters into our circumstance while we're offenders. We've offended against him, and he owns our cause, and he comes into our context to bring redemption to us. And so I would say that if you want to name the name of Christ, the fundamental thing that it means to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus, is that you deny yourself to enter into somebody else's circumstances and suffer alongside them so that you can minister grace to them. And so while there are consequences, and the folks that I've had conversations with who are following Christ behind bars, they're well aware. They get, yeah, I've sinned, and that's why I'm here, and I'm suffering consequences for all of that. But does the gospel have something to say about that in the restoration of that life? And that's what we want to say, is that yes, the gospel has something to say about that in the restoration of that life, and God can redeem and restore a life in the context of community with the gospel.
Absolutely. I think it's fair to say that the cross of Christ is sufficient to forgive anyone, to clear their debt of sin.
That's right.
And it is sufficient to transform anyone regardless of their sin type. Christy, how do you think families and communities, and our community in general, is impacted by incarceration?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, first of all, every person that is incarcerated is a person, right? And so before they were incarcerated, they were somebody's daughter, they were somebody's son, they were somebody's father, somebody's mother. They have their own children. And so I think it's real easy for people to distance themselves and to see themselves as different from, and to think, well, that could never be me, or that could never be my family member, or but really, ultimately, we all get touched by this issue, whether we have direct relation to somebody that's been incarcerated, or whether we're just living in a society where, you know, so many people are incarcerated, and families are largely impacted by this. And so if we think about even the ACEs study that helps determine adverse childhood effects and trauma on developing children, an incarcerated parent is one of those issues. And thinking about the fact that severe mental stress, separation anxiety, behavioral challenges, educational challenges, poverty from a parent that has been incarcerated because now it's a one-income family, or the child goes into a foster care system. So the impact is large, right? And then it's just a generational impact, and it's hard to break that cycle. But then for us to recognize that these are people, these are brothers and sisters, and they are worthy of love and grace and mercy and fellowship. And so it's been interesting to see, because as a church, during the shutdown, our women started writing to some of the Jumpstart participants behind bars, and who are still quarantined, by the way. And the idea that for a while they thought, there's nothing that I could possibly have in common with this person, or I couldn't possibly write somebody who's killed somebody, Or I most definitely couldn't write somebody who's neglected or harmed their child. And to see the discipleship that has happened even in our women as they have moved in and started to develop relationships with somebody they thought they had nothing in common with, and to find that we are all people. We are suffering from brokenness and wounds, and we are suffering from the harms that have been done to us, the sins that we have chosen, and the brokenness of the world. And all of us, like you said, are one decision away from being behind bars, and that we have far more in common with one another than we have different. And so the impact is, I mean, we could go into financial impact and stats and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's people. And these are people that God loves and that we are commanded to love. And so I think that's one of the biggest impacts.
Thank you, Christy. Don here is one of the co-founders of Jumpstart, which uses an inside-outside approach for helping those incarcerated live as productive citizens upon their release. In the world of reentry, there are many proposed solutions and programs to help those who are incarcerated live as productive members of society upon their release. Much of the research indicates that many of those programs are ineffective. Don, why do you believe that discipleship coupled with reentry services is the best solution for helping the incarcerated?
Well, first and foremost with discipleship, the key component is Jesus. And the other thing I had, as you asked me that question, I had to think back on my own life and my time of incarceration, and even upon release, how I so desired, just to have somebody to show me the right way. I had always kind of lived in pretty much survival or crisis mode, growing up. So I made a lot of poor decisions, but, I always felt that, man, if I just would have had somebody there to kind of hold my hand and show me the right way, or when those opportunities came to make those poor choices, I had somebody to bounce it off of. I think that would have saved me a lot of heartache, but I wouldn't trade it now for the world just because I was introduced to Christ through my hardship. So I think that discipleship is key because there's so many more men and women that's behind the wall that come from my same background, and that's just yearning for somebody to just take them by the hand and just walk with them through the good, the bad, the ugly, so.
Don, personally, I want to say thank you. 14 years ago at Tiger River Correctional, I was 20 years old, and you began pouring into my life and teaching me how to pursue and live devoted to Jesus. So thank you for making that your life work.
My pleasure, bro.
Bill, would you have anything to add about why you think discipleship is the answer?
Yeah, I think just the idea of one person who's following Christ coming alongside another person and saying, walk with me, I'll walk with you. When Jesus called his original 12 that we call the disciples, and there were a band of men and women who were around that, right, also. But he had this core group of people that he's walking with for 3 years. He's walking with them, he's teaching them. One of them completely abandons him, denies the faith, sells him out to the Romans. Of the other 11, when he's hanging on the cross, 10 of them are nowhere to be found. Only John is there with a few of the women. The women were hanging there and being faithful, his mom and some others, and John was there with them. But in general, those people that Jesus had been pouring into, they didn't do so well early on. Right? There was a lot of stumbling going on. There was a lot of halting steps forward in obedience. But out of all of that, Jesus was working with them, and then he restored them all after those great failures, after his resurrection, and really established the church to make disciples. That's what we're supposed to do, right? That's the whole thing. We're supposed to help people understand who Jesus is, baptize them into the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then you teach them to obey all the things that he's commanded. That's what discipleship is. You're just walking with people, teaching them how to follow Jesus more closely. And that's no different for any of us, right? But the thing that is distinctive about what Jumpstart is doing, and it isn't just Jumpstart, it's not just people who are incarcerated, but when people are dealing with the consequences of major sin, and then they have legal consequences as well, there are housing consequences because of the Fair Housing Act. They can't get into a good apartment complex that's safe, right? So now we take people who have begun to follow Christ in prison, and then they can't move. The only options they have for housing when they get out of prison is to go back and live with the same people that they got into trouble with in the first place. And we think that somehow that as a society is going to lead to a good outcome. And what I would just say, what got clear to me is that for us as the church, we're on the hook for that. I was just reading Matthew 25. I had to preach on it, and I was reading it, getting ready to preach on it, and I just realized there are brothers and sisters that we that are within our communities who are behind bars, who are trying to follow Jesus. When they get out, they can't get a good place to live. And that's on us. And like, that got real personal for me, that I realized when I stand before Jesus, he's going to hold me accountable for all that. Because we didn't have a lot of folks who have been incarcerated and who had needed assistance coming out. We haven't been a part of those kind of re-entries. And so for folks who have been behind bars, discipleship doesn't look like coming to a Bible study. Discipleship looks like getting in stable housing, getting a job, and learning how to follow Jesus that way, because they've only followed Jesus behind bars a lot of times. For a lot of folks, right? I mean, that was the case for both of you men, right? You knew how to follow Jesus when you're incarcerated, but you had to learn how to follow Jesus when you got on the outside, which is a counterintuitive idea that I don't think most people who haven't been incarcerated understand. I think they don't think about the fact that it was easier for me to follow Christ in prison than it was for me when I got out.
Absolutely.
But that is a fact. Yeah. I've learned that's a fact.
Yeah. It is. Brian, I know you've done a lot of work with the homeless population. You've done a lot of work in the inner city of New Orleans and have encountered a lot of things that have led you to be, super passionate about seeing those who are incarcerated served with the gospel. What would you say that to people who think that maybe discipleship wouldn't work in a correctional setting?
Well, I'll say this. We do go, and we've served in inner city New Orleans for about 5 years now, and so we worked with the homeless population there. And then you come home, and where I pastor right now, there's a fairly large homeless population. And so, the more that I've looked at it, and I actually just got done with a book not long ago called Second Chance Club, and it was a parole guy that worked in New Orleans, and he was just talking about how they would come through, and then they would work with the parole officer, and he's like, we wanted to help them get to that next spot of getting into real life and actually being able to make a difference. And he said it was just a reoccurring cycle that they would get out, and basically it's just like you were saying, they're put right back in the system of where they're around the same type of people. And one of the things that I think that just seeing that and being in New Orleans a lot with a lot of that different stuff, to me, is the discipleship part is the key. Like, I know from talking to you and looking at the different things that y'all have done with Jumpstart, seeing the actual discipleship stuff that you are doing inside those prisons. And you've got somebody like you who had been in prison and come out, and you had that radical change in your life, right? And you wanted other people to do it. And so now that's what you're doing. You're discipling people, all right, who, when they get out, it's just like you said, it's easier on the inside maybe when they get out, but what do they do when they get out? And that's why I have absolutely loved learning about Jumpstart, because I see the process doesn't just stop when they get out. Y'all are helping with the re-entry part. And so I would just say, I think that it's a system that more places need to adopt. I mean, I think it would be amazing. We actually had to go for background checks where the police station was in New Orleans every single year. And I'm telling you, like, you saw them come in and come out, come in and come out. And talking to some of them down there who had been incarcerated, and they just didn't feel like they had hope when they got out. And so that discipleship of them knowing and having somebody to walk with them, man, it's amazing.
Can I tell you, this is we have one of our members who's very committed to this ministry, and I'm getting ready to have my annual meeting with him once a year. He comes in and reminds me that we're not doing enough. And so I got that coming. It's on the schedule. Yeah. And so, and it's just, and this is a man who's leaning forward and leaning into, wants to do all that God has for him. He only works part-time and is mostly retired in his former vocation, and he's just trying to finish strong. But one of the things that he uses to push me, he talks about all that we talk about in discipleship and what we want to do in biblical community. He's been a part of our church for a number of years and been in a number of different groups. But his point is this. He says, all the stuff that we talk about trying to do in our groups, my Jumpstart groups at Perry are really doing. And so, which doesn't feel great, because, but his point is that there's a level of discipleship and biblical community that's going on because we're more honest about our sin. And so, because we're being more honest about our sin, when we're in a small group at Perry Correctional, which is just one of the local prisons that we're working in, that creates a baseline where we can talk about our need of God's grace. And when he sits in our regular groups, he's just like, we're not being honest about our sin the same way we are. So he looks forward, like during the shutdown, it's been devastating for him and a number of our members who've really gotten tied into that because the level of fellowship they have at Perry is much deeper than the level of fellowship that they have when they sit in their normal community groups at church. And I would not have thought of that way. That was part of his argument for me where he's been pushing me for several years now about how important this ministry is. And his point is, it's just a more effective, honest form of discipleship. I just thought that was cool, I mean, I want our church to get better, but I'm glad he's getting it where he can get it,
Absolutely. Christy and Don, I know that both of you all weren't always on the church choir and weren't always working in church. Can you just speak briefly to how being discipled and getting involved in biblical community and in a church helped you transition into a life of purpose and significance? Don, you want to kick it off?
Sure. Well, man, it's so that's a loaded question, but for me, I was able to see a side of life and even was able to discover a side of me that I never knew that I had. Just from, as I stated earlier, just from my way of growing up, I just thought that I was going to sell drugs forever and go back and forth to jail, and that was good. I was okay with that because I didn't have to worry about the bill collectors calling my mama. But after I had given my life to Christ and had begun to link arms with other individuals that hadn't had the same experiences in life that I had, they were able to take me along a different path, man. And it began to show me that through Christ, I'm more than what I thought that I was. And all of the gifts and the talents that he had given me that began to come forth, I was just astounded. But it took somebody just holding my hand to say, come on, man, don't walk back that way. Let's just walk this way for a little bit. Just let's go on this journey. And as I did it, I just fell more and more in love with Christ, more and more in love with the whole discipleship process, so much so that's why I do what I do, is because I want to be able to reach my hand out to that next man or young lady that have been walking on a different path and to let them know that it's a lot of potential over on this side for you, and God has great things in store for you. So,
absolutely. Don, also, we talked a little bit a moment ago about how the impact of incarceration on families. Mm-hmm. And I know that you had some children prior to knowing Christ, and they saw you in and out of prison. Mm-hmm. And then you've also had some children that have been in the home while you've been out and been a productive member of the community and involved in a local church. Can you speak a little bit to the different experiences that your children have had as a result of what Christ has done in your life?
Oh, absolutely. So my wife and I, we have 6 daughters, 1 son, ranging from 31 and my son is 11. So our first four are much older, so they watch me run the street, sell drugs all day long. That's how we lived. That's how I took care of the family. And they watched me go back and forth to jail, so much so the last time that I was incarcerated, when the police came to the house, it was my daughter that's 31 now. She was 14, and she opened the door. And it was just something that morning that I just felt like something is about to go down. And I was getting ready to take them to catch the school bus, and she opened the door. And because they had seen me live my life the way that they did, she was like, "Oh, no, my daddy not here. He's not here." And it's 6 o'clock in the morning, so the officer told her, said, "Well, you shouldn't be here by yourself," and scared her. And so I just got up and came on out the room and, changed clothes so that he could take me on to jail. And it was like 2 years before I came home. But at this point in time, my daughters were 14. When I came home those 2 years later, they were 14, 16. I had a 12-year-old, and then I had a 7-year-old. Now, my daughter that answered the door that day, her and my next oldest daughter, they were in junior high, so they were starting to like boys. But the thing that really blew me away is because Christ had changed my life while I was gone, now they wanted drug-dealing boyfriends. And it was the hardest thing for me to try to explain to them that you don't want to go through that. And, still children make their own choices. And one of my daughters, she had actually married a gentleman, and he went away before they had their first child while she was still pregnant. He did 10 years. He came home after 10 years. He stayed home on the street about 2 more years, and he just went back with 25. So.
All right. Now, what about your kids now that are at home?
All right. So my children now, so we have 2 at home now. We have a 13-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son. Although they know all of the stories, it's just a joy to know that when I leave home that I'm going to make it back, because I ain't out here doing nothing that's going to cause me to get into any type of trouble. And my son tell me this all the time. He said, "Dad, I want to be just like you now. I don't want to go down to the prison path, but I want to follow your path." You know what I mean? So it does my heart good now that I'm actually able to be a role model, for my children, and being able to help to guide their decisions without the guilt of saying, "Now how I'm going to tell them not to do this when I done did it,"
Yep.
Yeah, so.
Well, it's a beautiful thing. Research shows that if a child has a parent who is incarcerated while they're growing up, they are 20 times more likely to end up incarcerated themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's a beautiful thing to see that you've broken the cycle in your family.
Yeah.
And now you're at home discipling them and teaching them what it means to be a woman and a man of God.
And not having to do it from a payphone.
That's right.
Behind the wall.
Christy, would you speak a little bit to your experience and how following Christ has changed your life?
Yeah, so I had a little bit of a long and winding road to Jesus because, I fell into alcohol and drug abuse when I was 15 and was in and out of institutions and arrested multiple times and got sober when I was 23. But I didn't come to faith in Christ until I was 29. So really from 23 to 29 was a rebuilding of my life and trying to learn how to be a responsible and productive member of society. And that's hard. I didn't do prison time, but I have many misdemeanors and a felony on my record. And when you fill out a job application, or when you're looking for housing and you have to have references, I had to have people who were willing to go on the hook for me. And there were many times that I had to plead mercy. I had to throw myself at the mercy of a bank and say, "Will you please allow me to have a savings account?" And so it's not easy to rebuild your life after you have made some really destructive choices. And so, from 23 to 29, I was getting sober, and I was learning to become a responsible and productive member of society. But when I came to faith, I think really from 29 to 35, I was just learning what it meant to be a believer. And I really think something key happened to me, though, when I turned 35. We came to Grace Church, and I started to recognize that somehow there was an identity piece that was still sticking with me. I was still identifying myself as an addict, or as an alcoholic, or as, this broken person. And that was probably what I felt like was the truest thing about me. And so I remember, I'd been called for jury duty, which was the weirdest thing, because as a convicted felon, I can't serve on a jury. But I show up, and when y'all have to raise your hands on why you can't serve, and then you get called to the front, I've got one lawyer on one side of me and a lawyer on the left and on the other, and a judge in front, and they ask, well, what did you answer yes to? And I have to say, well, I have multiple misdemeanors of this, and I have a felony of this, and I hear this, you're dismissed. And at 20 some odd years sober, I hang my head, my tail between my legs, and I'm walking out the door thinking, that's the truest thing about me. That's what these people see. That's what they think about me. And I've been 20 years a productive member of society, right? And it was really through being discipled and having people who knew everything about me, 100% conversations, right? 100% people that they know me inside and out, who were willing to tell me, but that is not the truest thing about who you are. Who Jesus says you are, as spotless and blameless and without fault and without accusation, adopted, beloved, like these are the things that are more true of you than what you have done. And so it was through that discipleship that I was actually able to begin to identify myself as a child, which that one's still hard, that one's still hard, a beloved child, and not an addict. Somebody, Carrie, the way you say it, like I did drugs and I stole things and I cheated people and I lied to people, but I am not what I did, right? And that was the process of really being discipled.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That's incredible. And I'm thankful that you were able to lay a hold of the hem of his garment and be made whole. And what a blessing you are to so many. For those coming out of incarceration, they not only need to be discipled while they are incarcerated, they also need tangible, real support upon their return to the community. Research has demonstrated that without reliable transportation, without a stable employment, and without a safe place to live, their chances of going back to prison within a short amount of time are astronomical. So those are some of the key components to helping someone transition successfully. Bill, what ways have you seen Grace Church and other churches be able to invite people in to help people in that transition and provide some real support?
Yeah, I think one of the key moments for us as a people has been for us to realize that person, whoever that person is, Christy, when she came here, you when you came here, we're all part of one new humanity. We're part of a people that God's making, and we all got here the same way, by the blood of Jesus.
That's right.
And so for us, when you begin to see that, and then you realize the language that I use all the time is that we are on the hook for one another. So that's the thing, is that we're going to stand before Jesus, and we're going to render an account for the people that God entrusted to us. And you can hide from people that God's entrusted to you. In our community today with cars and mobility and the suburbs, if you can make it so that you never have to drive down a road where there's a homeless person on the side of the road. You can do it. You can work your route where the Good Samaritan's not even a possibility in your life, because you can make it so I never have to drive by anybody who's experiencing that kind of brokenness. And for us as a church, what we've realized is that we have to create pathways into our church, just like children's ministry is a pathway into our church for suburban moms who want their kids to know Jesus, right? So that's a pathway. That's a way. People say, hey, if you bring your children here, we have something for you. So what would pathways into the church look like for people who can't get just the most basic standard of safe housing? What would pathways into the church look like for people who have been struggling with systemic addiction that grew out of chronic sexual abuse that they experienced as a child, and then self-soothing and comforting themselves with that? How do we make our church a safe place for them so that they can come and feel like they have a pathway in? So I would say in those things, it's things like care and recovery, right? People come who are dealing with, they've experienced the love of Jesus somehow, they had a transforming moment, but they've been living in a lifestyle of prostitution. They need a place to live that's safe. They might need somebody to hide them from the person that was trafficking them. And all of that sounds like very specialized. It's not very specialized. It's just like loving people, and then you take the resources that you have and you begin to figure out, how do we share these with my brother and sister who are in Christ, who just are coming from a different place than I was coming from. I mean, I had two parents who loved me. I never lived a day that my dad didn't tell me that he loved me. That did some things for me. I didn't earn that. I didn't choose that. I didn't do anything. That lent some stability to my home. My mom did not have that. My mom was abandoned by her dad to a children's home when she was 7. But the consequence of what my mom and my dad did put me in a different place. I needed a pathway to Christ. But are we only going to make it where people who had dads who told them that they loved them every day have a pathway into our local church? That ain't going to be a very diverse local church. And so you just have to begin to think about issues like care and recovery, issues like housing, because we're signed on corporate leases for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get into a good apartment complex. And we have folks in our church who have rental property that they're being discipled because they're realizing, I don't have to maximize the rental values of my property. I don't have to not take rent. That's not even in anybody's best interest. There's not dignity in just giving somebody a place to live perpetually. But in saying, I don't have to maximize the return on my investment, but I can make an investment to create a pathway into stability for a brother or sister in Christ. Yeah. That's the kind of stuff. And then you're discipling everybody, right? Because we're teaching our rich people not to be greedy. We're teaching our suburban people, get out of your safe little neighborhood to see the brokenness that's around you and build some friends that aren't like you, right? And we're creating pathways for people to do that. Now, we're just in our infancy because we've just been learning about all this really in the last 5 years. I'm ashamed to say that it took us about 20 years to really get awakened to some of these issues and realize we have the kind of responsibility that we have. But God's teaching us little bit by little bit as we go. Right. And so I think that's the key.
As a follow-up question to that, I'd love to hear from you and Christy, since you're on staff here. What are some ways that getting involved with Jumpstart has benefited the members, the covenant members of Grace Church? Because maybe there are people who are watching this who are thinking, well, how is this going to benefit those I'm called to lead and serve? So as church leaders, how would you speak to that? How is this benefiting those who are in the pews every week, so to speak? How is getting involved with prison ministry and reentry benefited them?
Yeah, I think earlier I alluded to or mentioned that we had a campaign where we have our women writing, some of the women at Leith and Camille Graham. And, there's one story that really sticks in my mind. And so it was a woman who had been assigned one of the sisters at either Leith or Camille. And she made the mistake of Googling her before she wrote her. and discovered that she had harmed her own child. And this woman had children that she had adopted through the foster care system. And so as she sees this, what this woman had done, her immediate thought was, I cannot write this woman. I'm going to have to ask for a reassignment. And so in the process of that, she was talking with her community group leaders, and she was talking with the Lord, and her community group leader really challenged her, and she said, perhaps you have unforgiveness that you are harboring toward your children's biological mother. And so, she took some time to pray about that, and then it occurred to her that she had unforgiveness toward her adopted children's biological mother. And so she began to go through the process of learning what it looked like to forgive her children's mother. And as she did that, she was able to begin corresponding with this woman that we had assigned to her. And now they have letters that are going back and forth. And so what has happened is one woman behind bars is seeing a woman love her, and then the other has had the Lord reveal something that was deeply broken inside of her that has given her an opportunity to repent and to begin having some healing in that process that will also flow out onto her children, right? And so we've seen countless stories similar to that, where now women are realizing that they want to be more involved in the hard and the brokenness, things that they thought they could never possibly even get involved in. And now they are wanting to move not into just writing letters that is still somewhat safe, but now they're wanting to move in toward mentorship on the outside, right? And to get involved into reentry ministry. And so we've seen it be really fruitful in that way.
Thank you, Christy. Brian, in what ways would you like to see Marietta First get involved as a church? I know that you all are already supporting Jumpstart as a local missions partner, but what are some ways that you're excited about moving forward?
Well, I think just looking back and talking to you about different things with Jumpstart, I went back to a story in my last couple of years, and so I actually got to go in and work in one of our juvenile detention centers. And I can remember having a conversation with two men. I got to go 2 years, two young men. Neither one of them will be getting out. And I can remember talking to them, and the year before we had given them a Bible, and this is where I realized the whole discipleship thing and just kind of where it's at as far as what is needed. And so we were sitting there and we were talking on our last day while I was in there after doing the camp, and they were sitting there talking to me, and one of them said, he said, I said, if you could do anything, what would you be? And he said, I think I'd be a youth minister. And I said, so what are you waiting on? He said, what do you mean, what am I waiting on? I'm never getting out of here. He said, when I leave here, I'll be going into a larger incarceration thing. And I said, well, if you're a believer, a lot of these guys might get out, so why not be a youth minister here? And I wish, because of what Jumpstart does, I have been intrigued by hearing how the discipleship method and the reentry program works. And so I know that y'all are working on some projects as far as trying to get some more homes built for folks for reentry. And so I know I'm excited that our church is going to be helping and partnering with that. But I would encourage, I want our families and our churches, especially at Marietta First Baptist, I want them to be a part of that, for them to see that, if they give that $60 a month, that helps purchase a place for our folks who are coming out, who have had that discipleship process in prison, that are coming out and they're trying to go back into the world, and they're going in as believers, for them to have a safe place to stay. And so, simple things like that. Or you were talking earlier when we were out in the parking lot, talking about just hygiene bags, just anything that our church can do to be a part of that. We have a drug and recovery type program called Set Free at our church, and so a lot of them are like, hey, how do we do this next, and things like that. I just want to see our church be a part of a ministry where it's like 90% do not return to prison that come through the Jumpstart program. And so for me, I mean, that's where it's at. The discipleship part of it, I want our people to be a part of that. I want them to see the stories that are coming out, like you two that are sitting here on the stage, that you have a testimony for what this type of ministry is meant to you. So I want us to be involved. I want to be more than just sending money. Like, I would love to see us be a part of, be a part of that mentorship. That I think it's awesome that y'all are writing letters. That's just amazing to be able to hear that in here tonight. I just want our people to be a part of that, to understand that, you know what, we are all people, and we all are souls that Christ loved and died for. And so that's how I would love to see Marietta First Baptist and other churches that are in the area to be a part of this ministry.
Does anybody got anything else they'd like to add in closing? I thank you for tuning in to our discussion today. If you are interested in learning more about serving with Jumpstart, or how you or your church can impact the lives of those who are incarcerated or those who are returning to your community, we would love to hear from you. Over the past 10 years, over 3,000 people have completed the Jumpstart program and have been released into communities all across South Carolina. And through people partnering with us on the inside, doing the discipleship and the hard work of helping them replace the lives they've believed with God's truth and learning to live as daughters and sons of God, of those 3,000 who have been released back into the communities, less than 4% have returned to prison. The gospel works. Discipleship works. Let us get our hands to the plow and let's do the work. Would love for you to check out our work online and just reach out to us and discuss ways that you can get involved with a local missions opportunity that is making a difference. Thank you for watching. God bless.